Hi everybody, Mrs. Cragness here. Today I'm going to talk about some of the background you need for the first part of our unit on China. I'm going to give you some key terms. I'm going to put the movie that we saw, Engineering an Empire, in the context of early Chinese history and explain your next assignment. So I'm glad you're here. Chinese civilization is 4,000 years old. It is the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. Throughout this time, the vast majority of that time, China followed the same system, an imperial system of dynasties, and they have been instrumental in developing new technologies around the world. So what I want to do today is talk about some of the key characteristics of China that were established really early and that lasted for several thousand years. As I always do, I've put things in red that are really essential for you to make sure that you know when you leave here. The first concept today is the idea of a dynasty. I just used that word a minute ago. The Chinese have been ruled by a succession of dynasties. So a dynasty is a family, and within that family, the right to rule is passed from one generation to the next. So it occurs in the context of a monarchy, and in a monarchy, you know that the right to rule is inherited passed on from parent to child. And within that system, as long as it stays within the same family, the right to rule continues to be passed on. That's all considered one dynasty. So one family might rule a country for only 50 years or for 1,000 years, depending on how many generations it passes down to. Eventually, when someone from that family gets overthrown and a new ruler that's unrelated takes their place, then that's the beginning of a new dynasty. So dynasties are how we often measure and describe periods of time in China because many of the dynasties lasted hundreds and hundreds of years. The reason that dynasties often ended up getting overthrown has to do with the idea of the mandate of heaven. This is the Chinese belief about why a given emperor and dynasty is ruling them. The Chinese believe that God gives the emperor the right to rule, but that the emperor has to continue to earn that right by being a good leader. So this is broken down to 3 steps. The leader has to be virtuous and lead with ability. So if a leader is only looking out for themselves, not taking care to the good of the people, or is incompetent, then they are not living up to their end of the bargain. Secondly, this is true for each generation. So if one emperor has been a good leader, the next generation, the next emperor, still has to meet that same criteria of leading with ability and virtue. And the third idea here is that when that's not true, the mandate of heaven can be revoked. So if the emperor is negligent, if he doesn't care for the people, if he's abusive and cruel, or if he's just stupid and bad, then the people are going to revolt. And they believe that that means that the emperor has lost the mandate of heaven, that God no longer supports their rule. Because of this concept of the mandate of heaven, people who opposed rulers felt justified in rebelling. If a ruler was doing a really bad job, or if a lot of things were going badly, the people considered it a sign from God that that ruler was no longer fit to be their emperor. So that worked well when the ruler really was bad or cruel or corrupt, but sometimes the masses interpreted series of natural disasters as also a sign from heaven that the dynasty had lost their mandate. And so there were cases when empires were overthrown or dynasties were overthrown because of famines and droughts and things like that. So when we look at the long picture of Chinese history, because of this idea of the mandate of heaven, something called the dynastic cycle developed. The dynastic cycle is the idea that this pattern continued to repeat, although sometimes it took hundreds and hundreds of years to make one turn around the cycle. So when a new dynasty comes to power, a powerful leader founds that dynasty. They're the first leader in that new family that's going to rule China. That rule is passed down in the family and typically started with a period of power and prosperity. This new ruler would restore the peace from whatever unhappiness or problems were in place before, restore glory to the country. They would often maybe establish new trade routes or build roads or irrigation systems, find ways to improve the lives of the people, sometimes sponsor great new inventions. But eventually, sometimes in a short period of time, sometimes hundreds of years later, eventually the country, like all countries eventually do, would go into a period of decline. And during that period of decline, there would be maybe economic problems. The new emperors might be charging very high taxes to pay for building projects. There might be a series of natural disasters that are taxing the people in the country. The emperor might not be providing good social services. And then the people will come to believe that the leader has lost the mandate of heaven, and there will be a period of rebellion, and eventually that dynasty will be overthrown and replaced by a new, more powerful leader. So the first major dynasty in China is called the Qin. There were actually dynasties before this, the Zhou and others, but China was not especially powerful until this dynasty. It was pretty feudal, which means the power was pretty decentralized. But in 221 BCE, a man named Qin Shi Huangdi overthrew the previous dynasty and became the first really powerful leader of China. And he is actually the person that China is named after because his name, Qin, is pronounced Qin, and this is the origin of the name of China. Shi Huangdi was the emperor in the movie that you watched at the end of third quarter, The Engineering an Empire. He was the emperor who started building the Great Wall. He had the tomb full of soldiers. He was also the emperor who is considered the person that first made China truly powerful. Now, he didn't have much of a dynasty at all. His successors were overthrown right away, but he really changed the course of China. First of all, like I said, he made it much more powerful because where authority had been decentralized before to lots of local leaders, he put everything under his direct control and made a series of very strict laws. They were written down and enforced throughout China, and he set up military control in every region of China. So every region had a military leader and an army there enforcing the emperor's will.
You really got a Valorant key? Are you kidding me? Bruh. Game sucks. Go next.
Porter!
Yep.
I'm recording a lecture, kid. You cannot talk for like 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, I hope I can edit that out, but if not, sorry. Okay, anyway, you saw the movie Engineering an Empire. You saw all the things he built. That was the point of that, really. And you know he used widespread slave labor. You know about all the people that were buried in the Wall of China, but that he made enormous progress in uniting the country through roads, bridges, canals, and buildings. And he started the Great Wall. So that was the Qin dynasty. As I said, after he died, that dynasty ended, and he was replaced by a new dynasty called the Han dynasty. And the Han are considered one of the great golden ages of China. There are a couple, but this is the one we're going to focus on. It was the first golden age of China under the Han dynasty. And you can see it lasted for about 400 years, from 202 BCE to 220 CE. And the map shows you where China existed at that point. Today it is a little bit bigger. It includes more of this region here, and we'll look at that later. The Han Dynasty is known as the Golden Age for the same reason that India had a Golden Age, that it had a long period of peace, prosperity, wealth, trade, stability. And that allowed it to make a huge amount of inventions, to make many advances and accomplishments, and basically to be a great place to live at that point in time. So your assignment this week is called the Han Golden Age Museum Walk. And you're going to be learning about life in China during these 400 years. And in particular, it focuses on some of their inventions that have really changed the world. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that occurred during this dynasty that really changed the future of China and lasted for the next 2,000 years. One is merit-based appointments and civil service exams. Merit-based appointments means that somebody was appointed to a job based on their skill or deserving it. That's merit. Instead of being chosen because they're a relative of the emperor or because they paid a lot of money to get it or something else like that. Civil service exams means that people had to take a test to serve in the government. Civil service means you work for the government. So the Chinese government began offering tests to anyone who wanted to work in the government. Anyone could take the tests, and people with the highest scores were given posts in the government. This made huge advantages for Chinese government compared to most other governments at the time, because it meant that the people serving in government were highly educated and highly qualified. And that meant that there was a guaranteed stream of people that knew what they were doing throughout the hundreds of years, or thousands of years actually. Now, it was technically open to anyone, and so even poor people were able to take the tests. But the reality is that many of the people that did take the tests and move into government were not very poor because you had to study for a long time in order to do well on the tests. So sometimes families could afford to have one child really study hard and take the tests, but most poor farming families could not afford to have lots of their children studying in that way. The other topic I wanted to introduce is called the Silk Road, and in your assignment on the Han Dynasty, there's a great video and more information about the Silk Road. The Silk Road was begun by Emperor Wudi in the Han Dynasty, and the basic idea is that it was an overland trade network between China and the West. And there were a lot of products, which are also covered in the assignment, but the most lucrative were silk was sold from China to the West, and the West sold back to China glass, linens, and gold. And I wanted to explain that this road was not actually one road. What it really was, even though it's called that, is a whole series of roads, bridges, trails, pathways. In some places, there were 2 different routes you could take, and it was a 5,000-mile trade route used for hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's all I have for today to introduce you to this ancient China unit, and I hope you will follow up with me if you have any questions.